You could say that the storyline of wars starts actually in our relatively near future, around the 2030s or so. It's during that time that a company called Dyncorp creates what's known as the GRAV drive, or the Gravity Attuned Vehicle Drive. Basically, the idea is that we hadn't stretched beyond just the Earth and the Moon yet, maybe a little bit towards Mars, but let's face it, current technology just can't get us very far. The GRAV drive could, and it allowed us to finally travel within the solar system within a reasonable amount of time. So all of a sudden, the entire solar system opens up for human mining, human expansion, human colonization eventually, for human adventure, you might say, right? In 2037, the first ship with a grav drive was launched. It was called the Cavour, launched by SCL Comp Corporation, I believe. And the problem was that this was an American company that developed this whole idea. SCL Comp Corporation launches the first ship, but Dyncorp, who holds the patent, was the one in charge of the technology. They were an American company. And the very next year, in 2038, America started to sort of get wind of this idea that maybe this technology was going to spread beyond just U.S. companies, perhaps become a threat, and the United States government sued in court to try to stop that from happening. Oddly enough, and this is somewhat surprising, but you could say that business is heading in this direction even now, the business beat the government, and they were allowed to spread that technology and sell it outside U.S. borders. The U.S. government lost the case. Eventually, as time started to pass, Dyncorp started to realize that it could sort of offer this technology to the world and allow all of humanity to benefit from it, sort of a benevolent thing, but there was something they wanted in return. They went to the United Nations, which by then was starting to become more and more of a governing body for the entire planet, rather than just being an advisory body, you might say, to a lot of different countries, a peacemaking organization, the way that it is right now, the very inefficient form that it exists in now. They basically came to the United Nations and said, look, a lot of your countries are basically outsourcing stuff to multinational corporations anyway, things like Blackwater handling security in different parts of the Middle East, things like that. And multinational corporations are affected by all these proclamations and studies and all these regulations that the UN is trying to put out, and we as corporations affect millions upon millions, if not billions of people across the world. So, we offer you grav drive technology for your nations. Let's help Earth as a whole expand. But we want a seat at the table. Dyncorp asked the United Nations to give multinational corporations a seat within the United Nations itself. A voice, a controlling voice it winds up eventually becoming within the UN. And since grav drive technology was so important, the UN Security Council gave in and said, yes, we'll do it. You can have that seat at the table. Slowly but surely, oddly enough, the UN actually became much more efficient over time, because now it was being dominated by these business interests, and businesses know they need to turn a profit. They need to be efficient. They need to use their resources and people well in order to succeed, or they fail. They fall apart, unlike many governments across the globe. So what you wind up finding is the United Nations becomes more and more efficient over time, and you start to see this spread, but slowly across the solar system. We have mining operations, we have small science outposts and things like that. Although, slowly but surely, there are groups of people venturing further and further out, very much like sort of Old West pioneers. Eventually, those on the farthest end of the solar system, in the outer rim, as it's called, these folks start to live sort of a lawless existence, or an existence where they make their own rules, their own laws, you might say, to be a little bit more charitable. They become sort of like the outlaw gangs of the Old West, sometimes working together, sometimes, in fact, usually not working together at all, in fact, being rivals at times to each other. These groups, like the Accord, the Cartel, and others, like the Cogs, become known as the Mavericks, and they are a fiercely independent faction within humanity by the time of the war's gaming storyline and our novellas. Meanwhile, back on Earth, you have a group known as the, and I always have to look this name up to make sure that I'm not confusing it, the Pan-Asian Nuclear Coalition. The Pan-Asian Nuclear Coalition, who work together to try to provide energy for all of Asia, or almost all of Asia. Japan, China, Korea, or the Koreas, the two Koreas, basically trying to handle the huge energy needs of that entire continent. And it works for about 5 years or so. Then comes March 23rd, 2071, and this entire system breaks down. And all these nuclear power plants across Asia reach a point where they're starting to melt down. There's going to be a major nuclear or radioactive catastrophe in Asia if something can't stop it. The problem is the computer system that's controlling it winds up in a loop. You need to activate security protocols in order to use the overrides. But to use the overrides, to activate the safety protocols in the first place that would let you use the overrides, you have to be able to engage the overrides. It's one giant logic circle, and they can't find a way to stop it. They introduce a new AI, a new artificial intelligence into the system that will eventually, in a more advanced state, become known as Shocho. And it steps in at the time once they activate it and stops the catastrophe, but not before radiation has blanketed most of Asia, rendering it relatively uninhabitable for hundreds if not thousands of years. They call it now the Asian Wastes. There's very little left, very little people able to survive there, mostly underground. Those who were out of the country or those who were able to get clear before this became the catastrophe that it was are essentially refugees, and there's a major crisis in the world as far as population, where are these people going to go, resources, and so forth. So an initiative begins where the people who were part of those Asian nations decide they are going to act sort of as pilgrims, very much like the pilgrims that we think of in American history who came from Western Europe and came over to North America to start new colonies, to start a new life. These pilgrims are going to leave Earth entirely, and they're going to go colonize the planet Mars. They do so, and this is backed up by most of the Earth governments, most of the Earth financial institutions, because they want this to happen. It's going to ease the burden on Earth, and it's a great step forward for humanity. These Asian nations send out their pilgrims. They eventually colonize the planet Mars. So what you've got at that point is you've got basically two different planets run by humans, plus the Mavericks out there sort of doing their own thing. Problem is that those cultures start diverging quite a bit. On Earth, corporations grow and grow in power, not necessarily in a malevolent sense, though not benevolent either, definitely a profit motive to it. You slowly see sort of capitalism in its idealized form growing on Earth, and you get these huge cities called plexes developing, huge corporations developing, and eventually, right around, I think it's about 2161 or so, you wind up seeing the United Nations, which had become basically a world government, finally get dissolved. And in its place, you get the Central Governance Corporation, or CGC, that organizes things for Earth, works with other corporations like ICOM, Z Labs, some of the other ones, FedGrav, that will wind up seeing in the games, seeing in the RPG, and of course in the novellas and comic book series. Basically a very corporate culture. Countries don't really matter to people anymore. It's the loyalty to yourself, to your family, and to whatever corporation it is that you happen to be a part of. That's where the loyalties start to lie at this point in time. And the CGC is a body that you can vote in. You can have a say in it. It is somewhat democratic, but it's done in a capitalistic way. It's done through shareholders voting. And citizens can own different amounts of share in the CGC and therefore have different sized voices in the running of the CGC and the running of Earth, so to speak. As it's becoming more and more corporate, things on Mars are going very differently. On Mars, the fact that they are having to sort of fight to survive and fight to build a new life, you get sort of an idealized version not of capitalism but of communism or socialism, sort of a communal environment growing based a lot around Asian-style cultures, ideas of honor, ideas of spirituality, and these become very, very, very different ways of life.